A small feathered dinosaur stands in what will someday be Montana, early morning, 66 million years ago. The ground shakes for 3 seconds. Not unusual. Earthquakes happen. The shaking stops. The dinosaur continues drinking from the stream. 90 seconds later, the sky begins to glow. The sky itself reached 300 degrees Celsius. Every land animal standing in the open, anywhere on the planet, died at the same moment. Not from the explosion. Most never heard it. From thermal radiation, as billions of pieces of superheated rock re-entered the atmosphere simultaneously, turning the entire sky into a heating element for 20 minutes. A single impact releasing more energy than every nuclear weapon ever made, detonated at once. 66 million years ago, Earth was not alien. It was recognizably our planet. Flowering plants, tree structures you'd recognize, insects buzzing in air that would fill your lungs without issue. The climate ran warmer. No ice caps existed. Sea levels stood 200 meters higher than today. Shallow inland seas covered large portions of North America. A late Cretaceous forest was comprehensible to the eye. Oaks, magnolias, and ferns under a canopy of conifers, with birds audible in the branches. The main disorientation would be the size of the animals moving through it. In the Hell Creek region, modern Montana and the Dakotas, the morning of the last day looked like any morning for the previous million years. Large dinosaurs moved through open ground and forest edges. Small feathered dinosaurs, indistinguishable from modern birds in behavior, foraged in underbrush. Mammals, mostly rat to badger sized, stayed hidden in burrows. They were nocturnal, an adaptation to avoid dinosaur predation that had been maintained for 160 million years. Daylight belonged to reptiles. It had since the Triassic. No living mammal had ever foraged in full daylight and survived long enough to pass on that behavior. The Yucatan Peninsula was a shallow tropical sea, warm and inhabited by ammonites, marine reptiles, and countless fish species. The water was clear over carbonate rock, the same limestone platform the asteroid would strike in seconds. Across the planet, ecosystems functioned at peak complexity. Dinosaurs were not in decline. Fossil evidence shows robust, diverse populations right up to the boundary layer. There was no creeping environmental collapse giving advance warning. The sun rose. Creatures fed, hid, hunted, nested. The same routines that had persisted since the Jurassic. In shallow water off the Yucatan coast, the sky was clear. The surface of the sea reflected blue. Nothing indicated that the object traveling through space for 4 billion years was 90 seconds from arrival. The last normal sunrise in 160 million years looked completely ordinary. At 20 kilometers per second, the asteroid crossed from upper atmosphere to ground in under 3 seconds, approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, large enough to end an era, small enough that most of Earth never saw it coming. It struck shallow tropical water off the Yucatan Peninsula, punching through sea and sediment layers into crystalline carbonate bedrock. The initial crater excavation took less than a minute. Within that first minute, everything within 500 kilometers vaporized. Rock, water, life. Temperatures in the impact zone exceeded those at the surface of the sun. The destruction within that radius was instantaneous. The planetary mechanism separated from it immediately. The impact launched material upward and outward on ballistic trajectories. Some ejected at velocities exceeding escape velocity and lost to space permanently, most at suborbital speeds tracing parabolic arcs across the sky. Billions of pieces of vaporized and molten rock, ranging from dust grain size to boulder-sized fragments, followed trajectories that would return them to Earth's atmosphere within minutes. As they climbed, they carried the kinetic energy of the impact with them. That energy would convert to heat upon re-entry through friction with the atmosphere. In Montana, 3,000 kilometers north, the ground shook for 3 seconds. Seismic waves traveling through bedrock at 6 kilometers per second arrived faster than sound through air. A triceratops grazing in open ground felt the tremor, paused, then resumed feeding. Earthquakes were not unknown. This one was stronger than usual but brief. The air blast arrived roughly 10 minutes later, a pressure wave that bent trees and kicked up dust but did not flatten forests. Survivable. The danger was not physical shock. It was already arcing through the upper atmosphere overhead. 90 seconds after impact, the ejecta began re-entering the atmosphere, distributed globally across the entire sky simultaneously. Each fragment compressed the air ahead of it, heating through friction to incandescence. Across the entire sky at once, the cumulative effect was a sustained radiant surface. The thermal flux at ground level reached 10 to 20 kilowatts per square meter. Air temperature climbed from roughly 25 degrees Celsius to over 300 degrees Celsius in minutes, not from fire, not from blast, but from radiant heat transfer operating at planetary scale. It lasted 15 to 20 minutes. Re-entry physics operate the same whether the object is a single meteor or billions of fragments. An object entering the atmosphere at hypersonic velocity compresses the air in front of it faster than that air can move aside. Compression heats gas, the same principle behind a diesel engine, but at hypersonic scale. The object's surface reaches temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius and radiates thermal energy in all directions. The Chicxulub ejecta field did this simultaneously across the entire sky for 20 minutes. Fragments launched at varying angles and velocities reached peak altitude at different times, but all re-entered within a window of 60 to 90 minutes after impact. Impact physics and Earth's rotation distributed material globally, not just over the impact hemisphere. Dayside and nightside both experienced the same radiant heating. The normal cycle of sunlight became irrelevant. The upper atmosphere itself was the heat source. Thermal radiation moves at the speed of light. It penetrates air without warming it significantly until it strikes a surface: skin, leaves, soil, rock. That surface absorbs the energy and heats directly and immediately. At 20 kilowatts per square meter, estimates for peak pulse intensity, exposed skin blisters in under a minute. Internal body temperature, normally regulated around 37 degrees Celsius, begins climbing immediately when ambient air exceeds body temperature, because cooling requires a thermal gradient running outward. At 300 degrees Celsius ambient, the gradient runs inward. The body accumulates heat faster than any biological system can dissipate it. At 42 degrees Celsius internal temperature, proteins begin denaturing. At 45 degrees Celsius, cellular death accelerates across tissues. The brain, heart, and kidneys fail within minutes. The mechanism is direct and does not require contact with fire. The sky is emitting infrared radiation across the entire hemisphere above any given point. That radiation strikes every exposed surface simultaneously. There is no sheltered side. Every surface facing upward or outward receives equal flux. A dinosaur standing in the open at 3,000 kilometers from impact received equivalent thermal loading to one standing at 1,000 kilometers. Distance from the impact site only mattered for the blast and seismic effects. The thermal pulse was planetary in its distribution by the time ejecta had reached global altitude. Large animals retain heat more effectively than small ones. Lower surface area to volume ratio means slower heat exchange in both directions. In extreme external heat, this becomes lethal. A multi-ton hadrosaur standing in open ground accumulated thermal energy minute after minute, its core temperature rising before its skin showed visible damage. A small feathered dinosaur had a higher surface area to volume ratio, but at 300 degrees Celsius ambient, the thermal gradient ran inward, regardless of body size. Both died. The hadrosaur died slightly more slowly. A creature the size of a rat, if standing in open air, survived no longer. The improved dissipation rate is irrelevant when the environment is hotter than boiling water. The 20-minute pulse duration was long enough to cook tissue, but short enough that heat did not conduct deeply underground or underwater. Temperature modeling shows surface soil exceeding 200 degrees Celsius during peak pulse, while soil at 30 to 50 centimeters depth remained below 40 degrees Celsius. Heat penetrates only about 5 centimeters into soil during a 20-minute pulse. Water absorbs surface heating across volume without significant temperature rise below 1 meter depth. The result was binary. Exposure meant death, coverage meant survival. Shadows provided nothing. The heat source was the entire sky, radiating from every angle simultaneously. Earlier extinction models centered on impact winter, global cooling from suspended ash and soot blocking sunlight for months. That process killed many species, but gradually, over weeks to months. It couldn't explain the KPG boundary's abrupt transition. Fossils abundant below, absent above, with a millimeter-thin iridium-rich layer between. The carbon deposits at that boundary show isotopic signatures of combusted biomass, burned plants, not just impact ejecta. Continental-scale wildfires don't ignite simultaneously. They need a trigger. Dry vegetation exposed to 300 degrees Celsius air ignites spontaneously. The thermal pulse was that trigger. The fires were not the primary killer. They came after the animals were already dead. But they consumed the bodies and the landscape, leaving the charcoal layer the geological record preserved. The thermal pulse mechanism was recognized only after detailed energy modeling in the 1990s and early 2000s. Researchers calculated heat flux at ground level from ejecta re-entry and found it reached lethal levels globally. The physics matched the fossil evidence better than any prior model. The sky didn't need to stay hot for hours. 20 minutes was sufficient. Every land animal standing in open air, anywhere on Earth, received a lethal thermal dose in that window. Far from the impact, they never heard the explosion. They experienced no blast wave. They had no warning of any kind that distinguished this morning from every other morning of their lives. Just light, heat, and then nothing. The boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleocene in the geological record is not a gradual transition. It is a line. The immediate impact zone, within 500 kilometers of the Yucatan site, was vaporized before the thermal pulse began. No survival, no gradation. The relevant story begins where creatures experienced the pulse, but had survived the impact itself. At 3,000 kilometers, Hell Creek, North America, seismic shaking lasted 3 seconds. The air blast arrived roughly 10 minutes later, strong enough to bend trees and kick up dust. Both survivable. Then the sky began to glow. A Tyrannosaurus hunting in open ground experienced the same heating as a Triceratops 500 kilometers east. Distance from the impact site was nearly irrelevant. The single determining variable was whether an animal was standing under open sky. A Tyrannosaurus in open hunting ground had no behavioral response to light coming from the entire sky simultaneously. Its thermoregulation, built for ambient swings of a few degrees over hours, received 300 degrees Celsius air and a radiant sky pushing heat inward through every surface. Core temperature reached 45 degrees Celsius within approximately 10 to 12 minutes. The brain failed first, buried deepest, highest thermal mass, last to receive internal cooling via blood flow. The animal collapsed, still breathing. Cardiac function continued for minutes longer, then stopped. The size that made it the apex predator of its ecosystem, the mass, the metabolic infrastructure, the thermal inertia, was exactly the property that killed it faster than a smaller animal standing beside it would have died. Underground, the physics favored survival. The mammal that had entered its burrow at dawn, asleep through daylight hours as nocturnal evolution required, was already 40 centimeters underground when the sky ignited. Soil at that depth remained below 40 degrees Celsius throughout the pulse. Its body temperature never rose above normal. 2 meters away, a lizard basking in morning sun died in place. 30 centimeters of soil was the margin between those two outcomes. At 5,000 kilometers, Central Asia, ceratopsians grazing in open steppe died standing, bodies accumulating heat faster than blood flow could distribute it away from vital organs. At 8,000 kilometers, the antipodal side of the Earth, there was no seismic shaking, no air blast, no indication that anything had happened. Then the sky brightened. Ejecta launched at specific angles, and velocities had reached altitudes high enough to travel halfway around the planet before re-entering. The thermal pulse on the antipodal side measured approximately 15 kilowatts per square meter, slightly less intense, identical in duration. 20 minutes of radiant heat from a sky that should have been dark. A large sauropod stood beside a river at that distance, drinking. As air temperature spiked, it collapsed. Its body fell half into the river. The submerged portion cooled. The exposed portion continued heating until the pulse ended. 3 meters away, a crocodilian lay submerged to the nostrils. Crocodilians can hold their breath for 20 to 30 minutes without effort. It submerged fully when the surface disturbance began and remained under for 25 minutes. When it surfaced, the air temperature was dropping. The sauropod was dead. The crocodilian's body temperature had never exceeded 30 degrees Celsius. Accidental positioning and respiratory physiology, not evolutionary superiority. The pattern was consistent across every continent. Open ground equaled death. Burrows equaled survival. Water deeper than 1 meter equaled survival. The extinction was a snapshot. Where were you, precisely? during 20 minutes on one specific day, 66 million years ago. That snapshot determined whether your lineage continued. Mammals survived by accident. They were underground because they had always been underground during daylight. 160 million years of nocturnal evolution to avoid dinosaur predation. The impact likely occurred in late afternoon Yucatan time, meaning broad daylight across North America and the Pacific. Mammals were in burrows not because they sensed danger, but because being above ground during daylight had meant death since the Triassic. The nocturnal constraint that had suppressed mammalian body size, behavioral range, and ecological diversity for 160 million years became, in the 20 minutes of the thermal pulse, the precise adaptation that kept their lineages alive. Body size became irrelevant underground. A badger-sized mammal and a mouse-sized mammal had equal survival odds if both were burrowed. Surface area to volume ratios that determined heating rates in open air meant nothing when insulated by soil. The physical property that killed large animals in the open provided no advantage or disadvantage once you were 40 centimeters underground. Birds survived only through a brutal filter. Modern birds descend from a narrow subset of avian dinosaurs, ground-dwelling and shore-associated species. Wading birds had access to water. Burrowing shorebirds, species that still nest in soil tunnels today, were underground during daylight. Tree-nesting species, canopy foragers, aerial hunters, extinct. The sky was their habitat, and the sky became the weapon. The fossil record shows this selection clearly. Across the KPG boundary, bird diversity collapses to a handful of lineages all associated with ground or water margins. The radiation that produced 10,000 modern bird species began from perhaps a few dozen survivor species, all positioned at ground level during the pulse. Every bird alive today is a descendant of the few avian lineages that happened to nest at ground level on that specific morning. Turtles show the same pattern as crocodilians. Aquatic species crossed the boundary with minimal extinction. Terrestrial species suffered catastrophic losses. Shell thickness provided no protection. Thermal radiation penetrates keratin and bone given sufficient exposure time. Water provided absolute shielding. A soft-shelled turtle submerged in a river survived, while an armored tortoise on land cooked inside its own shell. Amphibians, tied to water by reproductive biology, had shelter proximity built into their ecology. When air temperature spiked, those near water submerged. Their skin extracts oxygen from water. They can remain submerged indefinitely in cool, oxygenated water. Salamanders and frogs near ponds and streams survived in high proportions. Those caught in open ground away from water died. Amphibian survival rates at the KPG boundary correlate tightly with proximity to permanent water bodies in the fossil record, a pattern consistent with the thermal pulse model. Marine ecosystems present a contradiction. Water provided thermal shielding, yet marine extinction rates were catastrophic. The explanation separates immediate from delayed effects. Deep water organisms were unaffected by the pulse. Surface plankton, floating in the top meter of ocean, received direct thermal radiation and died during the pulse. Their death collapsed the marine food web from the bottom. Ammonites, mosasaurs, and plesiosaurs starved over weeks to months, surviving the pulse, dying in its aftermath. Insects show survival sorted by life stage and behavior. Soil-dwelling species, beetles, ants, burrowing wasps, survived at high rates. Flying insects in open air during the pulse died. But insect life cycles include metamorphosis. Larvae underground survived even when adult populations died. Colony insects were already below ground in stable nests. Social insects crossed the boundary nearly intact, and that intact survival mattered for the recovery that followed. Pollination networks, decomposition chains, and soil processing required insects, and enough survived to rebuild those functions within years. Plant survival came through seed banks. Above-ground vegetation incinerated globally. Forests, grasslands, shrublands, burning during or immediately after the pulse. But seeds in soil remained viable. The fern spike, a layer of fern spores dominating the fossil record immediately after the KPG boundary, shows how recovery began. Fern spores are microscopic, abundant, and buried in soil. They germinated within weeks and spread across continents before flowering plants re-established. The spike represents fern opportunism, first to germinate in a sterilized landscape, building soil structure and ground cover that more complex plants would eventually colonize. Survival was positional, not hierarchical. A Tyrannosaurus, apex predator, evolutionary pinnacle of terrestrial carnivores, died in open ground. A shrew in a burrow lived. The shrew was not better adapted to post-impact conditions. It was simply underground when the sky ignited. Within hours, the first mammal emerged into daylight. The sky had cleared to gray, ash falling like snow. The landscape was charred vegetation and silence. No birdsong, no large animals moving. Bodies of dinosaurs lay where they fell, already decomposing in residual heat. The mammal was small, built for nocturnal insect hunting. It stepped onto ash, seeking water. For the first time in 160 million years of its lineage, daytime was not dangerous. The predators that had enforced nocturnal behavior for millions of generations were gone. Every ecological niche that had been occupied by large reptiles, the open ground, the forest canopy, the riverbanks, the daylight hours, was vacant. Mammalian evolution had been running in place, constrained to small body sizes and nocturnal behavior, since the Triassic. The constraint was gone in 20 minutes. Within 10 million years, mammals had colonized every continent and nearly every ecological niche. Within 65 million years, one lineage had built civilizations capable of reconstructing the event that made their existence possible. The specific positioning, underground during 20 minutes, determined whether mammalian evolution would have the ecological space to produce primates, apes, and humans. Survival was not inevitable. It was a lottery of location on one morning, and it ran only once. 66 million years ago, a feathered dinosaur stood beside a stream in Montana. The ground shook for 3 seconds. The shaking stopped. The dinosaur continued drinking. 90 seconds later, the sky began to glow, and the dinosaur died in the open air. Not from the explosion, which it never heard, but from radiant heat descending from an atmosphere full of re-entering debris. It had no framework for what was happening. The sky had never done this before in 160 million years of its lineage's existence. 40 centimeters underground, a small mammal slept through all of it. The pulse lasted 20 minutes. The mammal's body temperature did not change. It woke hours later to silence, and ash stepped into daylight for the first time in its evolutionary history and found the world empty. The apex predators that had constrained mammalian body size, behavior, and ecological range for 160 million years were gone. Every large terrestrial niche was vacant. The ecological radiation that followed, 66 million years of mammalian diversification, eventually producing primates, apes, and humans, was possible only because the thermal pulse killed selectively. Not the strongest, not the most advanced, the ones standing in the open. The Chicxulub impact ended one world and created the conditions for another, through the most random possible filter, where each animal happened to be standing during 20 minutes on one morning. The dinosaur at the stream died because it was visible. The mammal underground lived because it was hidden. The entire subsequent history of mammalian life on Earth rests on that distinction.